Nation. It is 23 minutes to 5 o'clock here. Nicole, Barbara and Jacinta with you. We're here right through till 6 o'clock. And we're going to introduce our very, very special guest to you in just a moment. Nicole's going to give a little introduction and stay tuned for a very important conversation. Nicole, over to you.
Thank you. We have the wonderful Jude DiMeglio Trang, and I hope I've pronounced that correctly, Jude, but we have her online.
You did a great job. Great job. Thank you.
A very warm welcome to you. Jude has written Opiate Nation, a memoir of love, loss and acceptance. And as we said before the song, this is I imagine a passion project after losing their son to an accidental heroin overdose. Jude and her husband John kept a daily journal for a year as a way to hold on to their son and their sanity as an enduring memorial to document their grief, and had a decision to write a memoir based on their journals and their son's life, which grew from their desire to help reduce the overwhelming number of lives lost to drug addiction and the 21st century. So a really big, important topic, and we're so glad to have you on board today, Jude. Very welcome. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Yes. Well, we've met sort of informally through your daughter at our wonderful networking group. So it was lovely to catch you then, and it sparked our attention, I know, from Jacinta and our perspective about the story and what's behind all of that. And we thought, great to have you tell the audience here about your book and the importance of opiate addiction around the globe. So we really appreciate your the sensitivity of the topic, but also your information around that. So we wanted to start the topic off by getting a bit more of that background on why you wrote Opiate Nation. It sounds like it's received a lot of acclaim and a lot of interest. I've seen quite. I haven't read it yet, but I do hope to. But it's received quite a lot of good reviews and accreditation across the globe as well. So, tell us a little bit about what drove you to write that.
Well, I think you said it well when you said that it was a passion project. I think about how a lot of different movements had started when, Mothers Against Drunk Driving started, when some moms got together because, this happened to them. Their kids were killed through a drunk driver, and or multiple sclerosis, walk for life, those things. And for some of us, that's just how we process our grief, and just you can only think of, oh my, I don't want this to ever happen to anybody else. And so we hope that by sharing our son's story that we take the pain that we suffered through and use it to help other people and be part of the solution to the opioid epidemic.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a lot bigger, and it certainly opened my eyes, some of the statistics that you also shared with us as well. So, I know that your background is in the US, but this is bigger than just a US story, isn't it?
Yes, and I think that, what has happened in the U.S. and our son experimenting with first alcohol, then prescription opioids. And what happens is that prescription opioids become too expensive, and heroin is cheap, especially in the United States, especially coming out of Mexico. And so it was easier for him at his high school to have heroin delivered than to go buy alcohol. So, I know it sounds almost like hard to believe, but it's such a sad fact. And now, and this relates to Australia also, anywhere in the world, you can have synthetic opioids delivered to your house in the mail. And that has upped the ante on risk as in so many ways, with fentanyl and carfentanil being added in, which are 40 to 100 times stronger than morphine.
Wow.
And so when you're possibly your pot, your ecstasy, all these different drugs can be and are being laced, plus prescription drugs. So what happens in the United States is that the these synthetic drugs come from illicit labs in China, flown into Mexico. In Mexico, pills like Xanax and Tramadol and other prescription drugs, Oxys, and party drugs are laced with fentanyl because it's cheap and shipped in, and people will take it, and they either, if it's not too heavy of a dose, they will take it and it ups their addiction, or they take it and unbeknownst to them, they die of a fentanyl overdose. So it's America's story, and something I think that's important for people to understand, because I've been reading and so the startling thing is that it for us, we look back, many of our regrets relate to having no clue that heroin was anywhere in our child's vocabulary, let alone in his world.
Yeah.
And I think that's definitely something we were shocked by, and I think that parents, the average parent would think that too here in Australia.
Absolutely, Jude. And as you said, it is it has been America's story, and I know that for many of us here in Australia, we've been following that and quite aware of that. But you just linking it now to Australia, and most definitely, I'm not sure of the level of awareness so much here in Australia of how bad things are. But certainly, as you also mentioned, it's so important to have these discussions, because it might not be something that parents want to face up to. Who would? But we have to. So take us through our future, that link to Australia and the concerns.
Yes. Well, and our concerns relate to, which is why we're here. We've got here right at the beginning of the pandemic, and blessedly, oh my goodness, we've keep getting our tourist visa renewed to stay. So because our only surviving child married an Aussie and moved here 13 years ago, and have the audacity to have our two beautiful granddaughters here. So,
how dare she?
How dare she? And so it's like a magnet, we can't stay away. And we love Australia. We love the culture. We love the people. We're 4 years into waiting to get a parent reunion visa, which seems to be, hopefully it'll happen before we die. But anyway, for Australia. So Australia's drug-related mortality rate is actually twice the global average. That is a statistic that is not a happy one. And the thing for people to remember, and I just got the new statistics for Australia, in 2019, people aged 20 to 29 were the most likely to have used an illicit drug in the previous 12 months, and cocaine use was its highest in that age group. Now, normally, cocaine and ecstasy are the party drug, right? They're infrequent usage. So somebody will use them at a music festival or, when they go clubbing. Now, cocaine is used by almost 1 million Aussies weekly, second only to marijuana, okay?
Oh, gosh.
So, and while there have been large increases in the heroin deaths in the past 5 years in Australia, approximately 2/3 of the more than 1,000 opioid deaths per year, 2/3 are now from prescription opioids. So I see this is where the U.S. was 15 years ago.
Okay.
Okay, so deaths in the U.S., now, from opioids of all varieties are approaching the 100,000 people a year. So that's and almost all heroin use follows prescription opioid use, because eventually you just need so much to up the kick, right? The tolerance just grows and grows. And I think one other societal thing, as I thought about this too with Australia, is that a book called Dreamland by Sam Quinones came out 5 years ago in the States. He's an investigative journalist, and it's one of the great books. And his thesis is that affluence and pain avoidance at any cost, along with lack of community, people, down the street knowing your kids and seeing, if they're getting into trouble, those two dynamics three are what they were the void that Purdue Pharma and Johnson & Johnson and these big companies that were pushing prescription opioids, saying that they were non-addictive. That's the void that how they took root, because they wouldn't have been able to take root had there not been a tendency to just avoid pain at any cost, and to not have the sense of community and community watching out. So I think Australia is still much closer-knit communities and families than in the United States, but I think with affluence that changes.
Yes. You can often go without knowing your neighbour for years and years, and then you can move to a new location where everybody, knows everybody. And there's good and bad with that, but it's the support and the community lookout and the networks there as well. So,
exactly.
Yeah, and the local schools versus, kids going off to other schools that might be further away, which also comes from affluence as well. I imagine has a big part of that too.
Yep, it does. So.
And Jude, it's Barbara here. I was just going to ask you.
Hi, Barbara.
How are you? Just going to ask you about the legal situation in America. I believe that there was a company that was being, I think a class action was taken out against them. Is that right? Because the company actually manufactured some of these opioids and claiming they were non-addictive. It reminds me of the days when the tobacco companies were denying all liability for the damage that their products cause. But is that correct?
Right.
That some company, a very wealthy family, has been fined or sued, or it's still going ahead, this class action?
Right. That's Purdue Pharma. They were the creators of Oxys in the 80s, and they were brought out, they were created for cancer patients, terminal cancer patients.
Right.
The thing was that then they realized how lucrative they were, and they started marketing for every little ache and pain, like when you go to get your wisdom teeth pulled and you get 30 of them. Happens to every kid in America.
Wow.
It's unbelievable. I had a hysterectomy, and I think they sent me home with a bottle of 100. I mean, and there is protection for some people, because there are people like me that if they take an opiate, they feel disoriented, they don't like it, and they stop ASAP. But there are other people where it says to those chemicals in your brain chemistry, and it says, aha, it's an aha moment. And this is where knowing your genetics, your family tree, I always tell people, get a hold of your family tree and shake it and see who has addiction hiding under those leaves. Because in previous generations, it came out normally as alcoholism and or gambling. And so you wouldn't, like I have in my family, my husband's family, there's alcoholism. In those older generations of my grandparents and great-grandparents, you wouldn't have heard of drug addiction. So you have to look back at the more common things that people were addicted to, and you need to know that, what you're fighting. You need to know your enemy,
Yes.
Yeah,
that's a really interesting view to that. So, obviously the genetic pool is really important, and back then the conversation wasn't about the term drug abuse. It was more about the behaviours. Was there a person that was at the races a lot, or it might have Uncle so and so that was always putting a little bit on, or had to sell the house one time,
running around with lots of women or whatever, whomever.
And they are and all can be indicative of what's happening, and then thinking about your own children and what they're exposed to now as well, because I believe Jonathan was very young as well. So when you think about, I've got a 14-year-old at school, and you think, well, that's very close to his age when he passed away. So it sounds like it's around at that age group. So also of your own family, not just those in the past, but thinking about who's out there for the future.
Exactly. And I do think there in America, and American Pain is another great book by John Temple that talks about the pain industry. In America in the 50s and 60s, Americans used almost no opiates or pain medication. And I would say that's where Australia was maybe 10 years ago. physicians knew they were dangerous. Today, America uses 98% of the world's hydrocodone and 83% of the world's oxycodone.
Really?
That is staggering.
Yeah, it's staggering.
Yeah.
And this came about by the promo from these companies. So, that's the world that our kids and for us, our grandkids are growing up in. And I think that also there is trauma. And I don't want to minimize that. The people who at Turning Point and the Rethink Addiction campaign that has started here under the leadership of some of the people at the Monash Addiction Center and Dr. Dan Loveman, they talk about trauma a lot, childhood trauma and sexual abuse, and a great book written by an Aussie woman, a dear friend of ours now, Jenny Valentish, wrote Woman of Substances.
That's right.
Came out several years ago, and for any women listening or any parent with children, she chronicles her growing up in Great Britain and then coming over here, and it's a humorous book because she's got a great sense of humor.
Yes.
She's a great writer, but I do think that the prevention through education to parents and children, you've got to start young.
Yes.
And because the statistics are that early exposure greatly increases the risk of lifelong addiction.
Yeah.
And it is that early exposure that you know how sometimes people think, oh, they're just, playing around with pot or alcohol, they're just kids. Yeah. Well,
No.
The gateways.
Yeah, that's right. And
the gateways.
And Jude, as you just mentioned, alcohol and marijuana, it'd be really interesting to hear from you where these two fit into this story
'Cause it's
as well.
Kind of like a gateway, isn't it?
It is. So where does
Yes, I always, I tell people, when our son was in his first recovery program, and he would argue with us, marijuana is not the gateway drug, and we went, well, all the statistics show he didn't like pot, by the way. It didn't do anything for him. But then I remember one day finally saying, "You're right. It isn't. It's alcohol." And every person I know, except for one, that has had a problem with progressing and being in hard drugs was drank alcohol first.
Yeah.
That was their very first experience, and what that does is that leads to euphoria. And as you all know, Australia has a very high percentage of the population with alcohol abuse problems.
We
And
really
so
do.
That's true.
Yeah.
We almost have this social acceptance around that's what it is to be an Aussie,
Oh, yeah,
you
very
have
much so.
a beer
It is.
and you go to the barbie and you have a beer. Or a glass of wine. Yes.
Well, and marijuana, the thing to remember, now I was not a drug user when I was a young adult. I was absolutely abhorred it and stayed away from it. But marijuana is not your parents' pot. It is not the pot from the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's
it's
it.
genetically modified, 10 to 20 times stronger. And then, as we said, now laced with all sorts of things. I mean, people put angel dust with it, PCP, they put, and then fentanyl. So they are not harmless. Although, I will say, when it comes to harm minimization and harm reduction and medicated assisted treatment, my husband and I are so for that. We are big proponents of it because we do believe that our son would be alive today had we known more and done more with him with harm minimization. And one of the things that especially for opioids, is there are drugs that can be taken. There's now a new one called Sublocade that is a shot that you can give once a month, and there's been a 2-year study just wrapping up here in Australia, and they've had great success, as they have in the States. But those injections, the Suboxone, the buprenorphine under the tongue, all these things, this is what you have to do. The labor and the money involved once addiction has set in is just amazing,
And I can imagine that you would have firsthand have a lot of knowledge around that. Obviously, you've mentioned they're going through programs, addiction programs to detox, to remove that, and just the expense, I imagine, around that as well as those medicated treatments as well.
Well, and in the United States, of course, we don't have universal health care.
Exactly. It makes it tougher.
That's
right.
Yeah, wow.
And so, and I think this is where then a really important thing comes in is the stigma and shame. When our son died, many of his acquaintances at school had died of overdoses. We never knew. We never heard a word.
Really?
Parents, especially parents from affluent communities, the high school, never said a word. And the shame and stigma associated with having your kid as a druggie or a junkie, and even for our son, we did not understand how embarrassed he was and how bad he felt for us that he had this addiction. And I always tell people, our son did not want to be addicted to heroin. When he started and played with Oxys at a friend's house because they thought it was a fun thing to do, he did not have any idea as a 15-year-old because his brain wasn't developed. He just didn't know. And it latches on. And so the need to reduce the shame and stigma for the addicted person, what happens is that keeps them in the shadows.
Yes.
And if you don't,
it's like a cycle, isn't it? It's a cycle. They feel the guilt and the shame. They want to escape from the guilt and the shame, so they start using again. And it's a very hard cycle to break, isn't it, sometimes?
Exactly. And like same thing with gambling, with alcohol, with pornography. And without the community, the communities and families can either create silence and keep it that way. That was the kind of family I was from. Everything was Victorian and shame-based and stuff. And that's one of the main reasons why how John and I can help is by telling our story.
Yes.
We can't bring our son back, but we can tell his story and urge people to listen to their child, talk openly and freely, get help. You guys have a great medical system that if you pursue it, a lot of the drug laws are changing. The jury's still out for me on whether there should be decriminalization of all drugs, not legalization, but decriminalization. But I do know this, that when stuff is kept in that, like another world, like in this shadowy area, people will not get better from it. And if we don't offer things like safe injection sites and needle exchanges, people cannot get better if they're dead.
No, that's right. No. It's gone too far. Jude, very importantly, just at this point, just listening to everything you've said, and you just mentioned it there about telling your story, we commend you so much. It's such a powerful thing, and it must take so much strength for you, your husband and your family to do this, and it's just so important for the community. So thank you so much for writing the book and for speaking out. As you've just mentioned, the stigma attached to it and the shame that keeps people in the shadows, that's not what we want. We want that to change. So you're part of the solution. It's amazing hearing you speak.
Well, and I the other thing that I forgot, I think we're right at the end here, but regarding health and fitness and wellness, I had a list that I got from somewhere about the top 10 ways to increase dopamine levels naturally, because that's the chemical that's in your brain.
I love that, Jude. I love that.
One is eat lots of protein. Next, eat less saturated fat. Consume probiotics. Big ones are, and this is for your kids, exercise daily, get enough sleep, meditate, music, group singing is so important. Music is a really big dopamine booster.
It is.
And the power of giving to others was one that I think when teaching our kids from a young age to not think about themselves first, to think about others, their neighbors, their elderly grandparents like me, or whoever. But there are things that, and it's interesting because when our son was using, when he wasn't in recovery, his exercise was non-existent. He didn't couldn't care about anybody else because you're self-absorbed, right? He didn't eat well. One of the things I see here was get enough sunlight. I mean, I called him my vampire. He only went out at night, you know. So, yeah.
And vitamin D is a big one for addiction recovery as well. So, yes, absolutely getting out and about. I love that. I love that you brought it back to, my realm in the nutrition world as well, because absolutely there's a lot of ways we can get dopamine naturally. And that's, as you mentioned, part of that prevention space, as well as the community space that you mentioned there as well, getting things out in the open, having that community space, and also obviously Big Pharma have a part to play in this too, and the corporate responsibility there. But the things that we can do in our own backyard are possibly the easier ones to start with, and then working from there as well.
And also, Jude, an understanding, excuse me, you have mentioned about the fact that it's not a character flaw that these people are suffering from. It's an illness. And as you say, sometimes people have the odds stacked against them with their genetics and possibly trauma on top of that. But I think that we want to be very... Well, we shouldn't be judging a lot of these people, and I think society, maybe it's starting to realise, some segments of society are starting to realise that that's not helpful, and these people aren't criminals, but they're unwell. So I think that we have to really sort of reappraise our attitudes.
Yeah, that's right. This is a brain disease, and just like other diseases, and once those chemicals get changed, it takes a long time to repair them, and a lot of hard work and effort, and it's like I said, it's a lot of that my husband and I just did not grasp that with our son, and we know we made him feel shamed, which is why I think we feel again so strongly to say that we need to make sure you don't want to enable people, you don't want to coddle them. I don't think you ought to have a person living at home in active addiction, because you will enable them. They don't belong at home, they belong somewhere else. Yes. But support and love, that's what we have to give.
So well said.
It's a nice one to sort of finish on, isn't it? That support and love makes the world go around. And I really appreciate you sharing a bit of love with us today in sharing your story, a very important story about that grief and the loss. And, obviously the stigma and shame, but also what we can do to prevent that in our own communities as well, and how big a problem it actually is, not just in the US, that it is also here in Australia. And there's some, if we can get onto it now, we don't want to be 10, 15 years down the track and in the same space.
And Jude, also your book, the book that you and your husband John have written, called Opiate Nation. Can people get hold of that book if they're wanting to check it out? Can we put some details on our Facebook page, or what can we?
Sure. Yes, any of your local booksellers will order it. Most of them don't stock it because we were self-published, so it's not like, on their book list.
Sure.
But they can order it. You can get it off Amazon, Book Depository, all those places. Just type it in. It's available in ebook now, paperback, and the hardback.
Fantastic.
Excellent.
Well, we will put links to that on our website.
I was just going to say thank you so much to you, Jude, and to your husband and to your whole family for willing to sharing this time with us. But also, I can see that a lot of schools might find this particular book very helpful too.
Well, I had got a couple of friends and psychiatrists and doctors who have read the book, and they have written letters for me recommending it for college curriculum for people in med school, and I haven't gotten around to that project yet. But
it's a big one.
I do think, there's great other books on drug issues and stuff. Our little niche is that this is a parent story,
yes.
and kind of one of the first ones where a couple has written a story together about their child, and so our hope, I don't know, hopefully our future is here, and hopefully we will be able to share in high schools or even younger schools, of course, to the parent groups, because it is the parents in the community and in your country that can say, we don't want this. This is what we don't want this in our community, and we want to prevent this from being so easily accessible for our kids.
Exactly.
Absolutely. It's a nice one to finish on. I'm just thinking I've got a 7 p.m. appointment tonight with my son's school, and it's all on drug and alcohol. I'll be a little bit more informed now, Jude, when I go to that.
Good,
Thank you so much, Jude. It's been wonderful speaking with you. We thank you very, very much, and as Barbara said too, to your entire family for taking the time.
Thank you.
Our regards to John and the family.
Ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jude.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.